Hi everyone, we now proceed to the part 2 of the lecture on autonomic and somatic nervous system. We are going to further describe the neuroeffector junction in the autonomic nervous system, as well as briefly describe how the central nervous system regulates the autonomic function. So, what is an autonomic neuroeffector junction? The targets of the autonomic neurons are your smooth muscles, your cardiac muscles, your exocrine glands, few endocrine glands, as well as the lymphoid and adipose tissue. So the synapse between a postganglionic autonomic neuron and its target cells or effector organs is called the neuroeffector junction. So synapse between the autonomic postganglionic neurons and their effector organs differ from the neuron to neuron synapse. So postganglionic neurons do not have axon terminals. Instead, the axon of a postganglionic neuron splits into branches bearing the swellings, which is called the varicosity. So this is a diagram of the neuroeffector junction in the autonomic nervous system. So within this varicosity, neurotransmitters are synthesized and stored in vesicles. Neurotransmitters are then released from the varicosities or swellings located at intervals along the axons of the postganglionic neurons. So the branch end, as you can see these branches of the axon, lie across the surface of the target tissue. So the neurotransmitter is simply released into the interstitial fluid to diffuse to wherever the receptors are located. So the diffuse release of autonomic neurotransmitter means that a single postganglionic neuron can affect a large area of the target tissue. So the primary autonomic neurotransmitters, which are the acetylcholine and norepinephrine, can be synthesized in the axon varicosities. So both are small molecules and are easily synthesized by cytoplasmic enzymes. So these neurotransmitters made in the varicosities are then packaged into synaptic vesicles for storage. So neurotransmitter release follows the pattern found in other cells, which includes the depolarization of the membrane, the calcium signal, and exocytosis of the neurotransmitter. So when an action potential arrives at the varicosity, the voltage-gated calcium channels will open upon depolarization of the membrane. So when calcium ions enter the neurons, the synaptic vesicle contents are then released by exocytosis. Once neurotransmitters are released into the synapse, so they either diffuse through the interstitial fluid until they encounter a receptor on the target cell, or they actually drift away from the synapse. So neurotransmitter activation of its receptors terminates when the neurotransmitter diffuse away, or they are metabolized by enzymes in the extracellular fluid, or is actually transported into the cells around the synapse. So the uptake of the neurotransmitters by the varicosities allowed neurons to reuse the chemical. So this is the reuptake of the neurotransmitters. So in this example, norepinephrine is synthesized in the varicosity from the amino acid tyrosine. So once released into the synapse, norepinephrine may combine with an adrenergic receptor on the target cell, or either diffuse away or being transported back into the varicosity. And inside the neuron, the recycled norepinephrine is either repackaged into the vesicle or broken down by the enzyme, the monoamide oxidase, which is the main enzyme responsible for degradation of catecholamine. So we now move on to briefly describe how the central nervous system regulates the autonomic function. So the major brain areas that regulate the autonomic function include the hypothalamus, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The hypothalamus initiates the flight or fight response to elicit a widespread activation of the sympathetic nervous system when a person is in danger or excited. So the hypothalamus contains the regulatory centers for body temperature, food intake, and the water balance. So all of which are regulated by the autonomic neurons. The medulla oblongata and pons contains the cardiovascular and the respiratory regulatory centers that control the heart, the blood vessels, and the smooth muscles in the respiratory airways and regulate the autonomic breathing patterns. The autonomic nervous system works closely with the endocrine system and the behavioral state system to maintain homeostasis in the body. So sensory information from the somatosensory and visceral receptors goes to the homeostatic control centers in the hypothalamus, pons, and medulla. And these centers monitor and regulate important functions such as blood pressure, temperature control, and water balance. The hypothalamus also contains neurons that act as sensors, which is called the osmoreceptors, which monitor osmolarity, and thermoreceptors, which monitor body temperature. Motor output from the hypothalamus and brainstem creates autonomic responses, endocrine responses, and behavioral responses such as drinking, food seeking, and temperature regulation. So these behavioral responses are integrated in brain centers responsible for motivated behaviors and control of movement. So in addition, sensory information integrated in the cerebral cortex and limbic system can also create emotions that can influence the autonomic output. So examples such as blushing, fainting, and an upset stomach are examples of emotional influences on autonomic functions. So understanding the autonomic and hormonal control of organ systems is the key to understanding the maintenance of homeostasis in most of the systems of our body. So this is a short lecture from the previous part to further explain the autonomic nervous system, particularly the neural effector junction and the signal transmission occurring at the neural effector junction. So we also want to understand how the autonomic function is regulated by the central nervous system, as well as identify the brain areas that regulate the autonomic function. So would you be able to answer this question? So the answer is varicosity. So instead of axon terminals, postganglionic autonomic neuron contains the varicosities, which are swelling at the end of the axon. And varicosity is the site for the synthesis and storage of the neurotransmitters, which are mainly the norepinephrine and the acetylcholine.